Are we good to go?
Natural ecosystems in Sri Lanka provide clean water, food, medicine, carbon storage, recreation and habitats for local communities, wildlife and fisheries, and prevents floods and erosion. Poorly coordinated agriculture, transport, power, urban development leads to uncontrolled development pressures on the environment, degrading the ecosystems, reducing the benefit of local communities and national economy. If well managed, these areas will benefit the national economy, spur Sri Lanka's nature-based tourism potential, and help address local challenges brought on by poverty, decreased productivity and degradation of land and water, human-wildlife conflicts, and climate change. Us as part of the ecosphere and also as innovators should also be the protectors of our nature. Save to serve.
Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to you all, RD academic staff, senior lecturers, all BLA graduates and undergraduates, and everyone who's joining with us today for the fourth episode of Law Station for the year 2021-2022. Save to Serve, Conserving Landscapes for Wildlife and People, brought to you by the Student Society of Landscape Architects. For the benefits of those who are joining with us for the first time, let me introduce to you what Law Station is all about. Law Station is a series of events that are organized by the SSLA with the hope of imparting knowledge, information, and awareness about ever-changing field of landscape architecture to our fellow undergraduates. And as the fourth episode of this year, we have taken an approach to conduct a discussion based on what encompasses landscape conservation, its benefits to local communities, and bridging the gap between conservationists and local communities. Today, we have with us a wonderful individual to share her experiences with us. She is a professor at the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences of University of Colombo, has a PhD in conservation biology from the University of Cambridge in England, and BSc First Class Honours in Zoology. We warmly welcome you today, our guest speaker, Professor Mayuri Vijayasinghe. Before commencing, I have a kind reminder to our audience. Please keep your mics muted at all times to avoid background noises and any interruptions. And if you have any questions regarding the session, please don't hesitate to post them in the Google form that we have shared in the chat. They will be forwarded to our speaker and clarified during the Q&A session at the end of the event. Without further ado, let me now welcome this amazing personality on screen to commence the session. Madam, over to you.
So thank you very much, Lihini. And a very, I would say, good evening to all of you again. Thank you very much for inviting me to your, is it a monthly talk? Anyway, the fourth talk of this Law Station. I was actually kind of given this topic, but I thought it very appropriate that I stick with it because you as landscape architects, your prime role is to save landscapes, to design and to formulate your strategies so as to conserve the landscapes, and that would then help you to get the services that are generally offered by a landscape. So without any further ado, can I have the sharing rights, please? I have already been given, right? All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, madam.
Right. Okay. So welcome once again. And it's actually a pleasure for me to have this or do this little presentation to you. And I hope that I will be able to, as an ecologist and a zoologist, give you some insight to your further work in the field of landscape ecology. I think, just give me a minute. For some reason, the first slide has gone amiss. Just hang on for a minute. Okay. Hang on for a wee bit. Right. All right. All right. So my presentation is basically structured in this way. First, we'll be looking at the word SAVE. And under that, I will be looking at what encompasses landscape conservation. And under that, the plight of our landscapes today, the importance of scale, right? You as landscape architects talk so much about scale, and identifying critical elements. Then 2, deriving services, the benefits that we get from conserving landscapes, and then making it happen, right? The 2 latter topics, deriving services and making it happen, would then refer to the serve portion of this title. So save to serve. Now, first looking at the plight of our landscapes today, and here in this slide, I have only depicted some of the problems that we see due to linear infrastructure. Now, when you say linear infrastructure, that includes the roads, the railway, the power lines, right? Maybe canals, all linear type of development that have affected our landscapes. In the first one, Manampitiya Railway, you can see, although the railway moves over the river, right? Similarly, you can see a bridge, although it moves over the river, right? You can see that there's a lot of change. If you look at the river before these 2 structures, you can see what these 2 structures have really done to the river. There is a lot of sedimentation, which then would lead to impeding the water flow in that particular river. Then power lines and roads in the Knuckles Range. What has that done? That has also created a barrier, vertical and the aerial and a terrestrial barrier in a mountainous range. Then if you look at the road traversing to the Kottava Reserve, now Kombala Kottava is a very small reserve in Galle, right? And here you can see that the road, this is a main road, has divided, fragmented the little rainforest into 2 portions. Then you can see the marshland, the Yugadanavi power plant near the Muthurajavela area that has been constructed some time ago, but filling up marshland. Then you can see the Vilpattu National Park, where sections have been cleared in order for roads and also for cultivation and human settlements. So all in all, what we have done to natural landscapes results in the loss of habitat, fragmentation, and also isolation of these natural elements. So loss, fragmentation, and isolation are the key impacts human interventions have on natural ecosystems. Now, this can happen on land, that is in terms of for terrestrial ecosystems, as well as we see in the river, for aquatic ecosystems as well. So this is just one phase of explaining the plight of our landscape. Here I have also shown two sectors, the wet zone. This is a Singaraj rainforest. Here also you can see that much of the rainforest has been cleared, right? There are patches left of it, and in between there are plantations and settlements. Then even if you take the dry zone, this is the Wilpatha National Park, you can see that patches of the forest have been cleared for other uses, so to speak. Now, what are the consequences of such changes on biota or on plants and animals? Now, as landscape ecologists or architects, you must be aware how such interventions would then impact upon species, right? So first is, of course, obvious. It's the loss of physical space, right? The more you remove a natural habitat, the less space, physical space, there will be in order for species to live. Then changes in microclimatic conditions, you call this an edge effect, right? You call it an edge effect. What are the changes? The temperature can increase, relative humidity decreases, the density of plants, because there's as soon as edge is created, there's a lot of light, right? So that will trigger exponential growth of plants at the edges, right? So the density of plants sometimes is greater at the edges than at the core areas, but the canopy will be much less. So the wind, the effects of the wind will be greater at the edge. If you go to the middle of a forest, the wind factor will be very low, but at the edge it will be high. So all in all, there will be changes in the microclimatic conditions. And that would create fewer optimal habitats for species that are used to normally living in these natural habitats, right? So as soon as you create an edge, that will reduce. Now, for example, if you take a tiny forest patch, there will be actually hardly any areas to call a core. There the conditions are optimal because the edge effects will penetrate right to the center. If it's a larger forest, then certain areas in the center might be fairly safe. Then these interventions also cause barriers to species movement. Whether it's terrestrial, whether animal moves over land, if there are tea plantations around, that will be different to a forest. So if a species, say a leopard, needs to get from forest A to forest B, it will have to cross the plantations. And we know very well, right? Crossing plantations. Now, I think yesterday there was another death of a leopard in a tea estate. You know, the barriers to movement. Now, these are species, large species. They need large spaces to hunt. So if a forest patch is very small, they would have to use another forest patch as part of its home range. So to use that forest patch, it will have to move from one to the other. And if you have to move over land, then if that land is hostile, if there's a road, you might increase road kills, or in other ways, even other species might be exposed to, say, pesticides and herbicides when they are crossing the plantations, right? So all in all, barriers to movement are created. The greater the distance between patches, the greater the adverse impact on the species. Then it will also hamper ecological processes, right? Now, if the area is, a particular species is wind pollinated, if the wind changes, the wind direction or the wind intensity changes, then that will hinder the process of wind pollination. Then sometimes the pollinators, bees, might be living inside a forest, right? And then they might go and pollinate the cultivations around it. But when the forest gets smaller and smaller, then the bees might not be able to live. The conditions might be not suitable for them to live, and therefore the bees may no longer be able to provide that service to the plantation. Now, other things also can indirectly happen when anthropogenic impacts, say the creation of a road through a forest happens, then the other incidents like poaching and other illegal activities like tree felling, because earlier the forest was secluded, but now you're providing ready-made entry by having an access road. Then poaching and other illegal activities also can increase. Then there can be also the spread of invasive species. As soon as you open up a forest, or I'm saying forest, but it need not be only be a forest, it can be a grassland, any natural habitat, it can be a river, it can be a water body, right? As soon as the conditions are changed, other threats like the spread of invasive species can also threaten the biodiversity. Now, all in all, in the long run, all of these factors would result in the loss of biodiversity. Now, should we be worried? Just look at the scale, right? And you would have heard that we are, the era that we are in is the era of the sixth mass extinction. Why do you say that? Because if you look at the graph, okay, if you look at the graph here, you can see that from the 18 to 1900s, that the extinction rates of species have exponentially increased. So that is why this is globally, and that is why this is a shocking reality globally, right? This is why it has been dubbed the sixth mass extinction. Now, how is it in Sri Lanka? The situation is as bleak in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, you know, is a biological diversity hotspot. Why do you call it a hotspot? We have many species, the density of species is high, the density of endemics is high, right? Endemics are those that are found only in Sri Lanka, right? If they are lost to the whole world. And the most recent Red Data book says that, I have just quoted a few, 19 endemic amphibians, that is frogs and toads, have not been recorded in the last 100 years. So we have about 125 amphibian species already recorded as being extinct. Then it goes on to say 1 in every 2 species of freshwater fish, 1 in every 2 species of amphibians, reptiles and mammals, and 1 in every 5 species of birds are becoming extinct in the wild. They are threatened and therefore becoming extinct in the wild. So you can see, when you talk of the bleak scenario of our landscapes, this is a result of having brought the landscapes to such a dire situation. I thought I'll just put 2 cartoons, right? We know that biodiversity is suffering, but who cares? As the first cartoon says, the trees rest in peace, reptiles, fish, birds, all have died out, rest in peace, but who cares? And in the second, shows that he's giving a huge bundle of money to the sun, saying this is for your future, savings for your future, but what for? Because the sun is now depending on oxygen from a cylinder for survival. So why does it matter? Because indeed, the very survival of human beings, let alone or leave aside the ethical considerations of saving species, the very survival of humans are dependent on biodiversity and natural ecosystems for survival. So to just elaborate on should we care? Yes, we should, right? Each day, humans are supposedly using about 40,000 species, directly or indirectly, most of which go totally unnoticed. And this paper was published in 2000, right? And 3 crops, that is wheat, corn, and rice, provide 60% of the plant-based food. Right? So we need these crops, we need biodiversity. Then what of genetic diversity? Should we be worried to the extent of preserving genes? Yes, rice varieties in Asia, we have had thousands, but now a few dozen, for example, is left because of changes in the habitat. In Thailand, it says 50% of the rice paddies, you know that Thailand is primarily a rice growing country, and 50% of the rice paddies grow only 2 varieties. Now, there is a problem for resilience. What do you mean by resilience? Adaptability. Because the more you breed, for example, for harvest, you're compromising on the disease resistance. You're compromising on the climate resistance, right? So to get more and more harvest, you're only concentrating and focusing your efforts on 2 or 3 rice varieties, letting the others go extinct in the wild because you're not saving those or conserving those species. But what happens when there's climate change? You know, climate change is happening today. And if these species are not able to stand the heat, then all your food will be down the drain. No matter if you're breeding the varieties for better harvest, if they're not able to withstand climate change, then you would not even get the harvest because those crops will not survive with the warming of the weather. Then what about drugs? 25% of the drugs we use are derived from rainforest plants. 70% of cancer drugs are natural, or the synthetic products mimic the natural compounds. So that says that every time a species goes extinct, we miss out on the potential to produce new medicine. Now, we know that a lot of algae, in marine algae, right, they are known for their bioactivity for various drugs, various diseases. But with the pollution of oceans, these and also probably the warming of the oceans, many of these algal species will die out. Then we lose the potential. We haven't even discovered the potential of some of these bioactive compounds. Then forests and natural habitats are also indirectly, they also help in preventing pest-borne diseases because these natural habitats act as reservoirs to keep the pests at bay. The minute you clear the forests, and even species like mosquitoes, right? They do find reservoirs in forests. As soon as forests are cleared, they come out and do a lot of damage. Yes, we should care about the loss of biodiversity and the state of our landscapes because biodiversity benefits businesses, as I saw in your Low Station little documentary that you all had done. A lot of tourism, particularly being a tropical island, Sri Lanka has a lot of potential, right? More than half of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. Medicines from, I can't see this, oops, Medicines from natural products are worth about 75 billion, it says. Then what about our jobs, employment, livelihood? We derive approximately 125 billion from natural ecosystems each year. So our economy, and this is the plight of our, partly the plight of our economy in the present day. Because of COVID, we did not get a lot of tourists, and then we did not have chances of earning the much needed dollars, right? So Sri Lanka particularly is heavily dependent on a lot of things, not only on tourism, but for jobs in the marine sector, because we're surrounded by the ocean, we have lagoons, we have estuaries. A lot of rural folk are engaged in many marine related livelihoods, right? Globally, 3 out of 4 jobs are dependent on water, while the agricultural sector employs over 60% of the world's working poor. So agriculture means biodiversity. Then biodiversity protects us. It makes the earth more habitable. We have oxygen to breathe, right? All the gases, carbon dioxide, not too much. It's absorbed by the plants. Then what about the natural disasters? We are protected from landslides, from floods, from sea erosion. Our soils remain fertile, right? Our water is purified, all because of biodiversity. Now, this biodiversity, when you speak about biodiversity, you don't just talk about species, it means genes, species, and ecosystems, right? 3 levels of biodiversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So all of these is what sustains life. Now, if we don't take heed, what will happen? There will be food and fuel shortages, water supplies will diminish, flood risks, some of these we are already experiencing, and in general, reduced well-being. Now, the photo that I have depicted here is the Time magazine, where you have Rachel Carson. I'm sure many of you have heard of Rachel Carson and probably also read her book on Silent Spring, where in 1965, she sounded an alarm about the plight of our landscapes, particularly because of the overuse of pesticide and specifically DDT, right? So I quote, "But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." So this was told by Rachel Carson, and we know why. When we temper or affect the landscape, natural landscape beyond a tipping point, that would again hit us and our human survival. So we kind of looked at of the plight of our landscapes, and that's something that we are very much in the know, right? If you look at the TV all the time, we know how badly, in what a bad shape our landscapes are, right? Then we'll look at the next 2 components: importance of scale in conservation and identifying critical elements. So this, I think, as architects and maybe landscape architects, you would be quite familiar with, right? Conservation of biodiversity is mandatory. We saw that without biodiversity, our survival, in fact, will be doomed. But at what scale should we be focusing? Yes, conservation is necessary. I said biodiversity means genes. You can look at biodiversity at the level of genes, species, and ecosystems. But what are we talking of when we talk of conservation of biodiversity? Should we focus on species or genes, communities, ecosystems, or landscapes? So the species here depicted at the start, different species. We may be interested in one threatened species that we are trying to conserve, maybe the sloth bear or something like that, right? Or are we going to, then we'll have to single out the species, the threatened species separately and conserve them. You're not recognizing the interlinkages between these species. Or are we going to conserve a community? What do you mean by a community? In scientific terms or ecological terms, it means a collection of species or organisms living in a particular area. So it's demarcated by an area, and within that there are these species. So are we going to focus our attention, conservation actions on a community, particular community, a river community, a forest community, right? On the biotic elements, living elements. Or are we going to go to a broader scale of an ecosystem? Now the ecosystem might contain different communities. It contains different species and it might also contain different communities. Because say an entire rainforest ecosystem might have a river community, might have a marsh community, a little marsh habitat within that rainforest. So are we going to look at it in entirety? Or we can go even beyond, where we look at a landscape, where a landscape would then encompass many ecosystems and matrices in between, many ecosystems and matrices, right? So which of these should we target our conservation efforts on? Now, our objective should be to facilitate the beneficial interactions and mitigate the adverse impacts, right? So by conservation, you're trying to increase the benefits and mitigate any adverse impacts that we might currently be facing. If that is the case, which level should we be focusing on? Now, in order to determine the level or where we should focus our attention on, our decisions should be based on science or scientific know-how, through which we must identify the interactive elements and processes, right? We must realize the interactive nature of the elements and the processes in the area that we wish to conserve. Now, something like this would be very important in today's context for two reasons. Particularly because the natural habitats have become so small. Now, say 50 years ago or maybe 100 years ago, Singharaja, the Singharaja rainforest in its entirety, we would be able to just take a hands-off policy and say, okay, the rainforest will sustain itself. We don't need to do anything. That's called a hands-off approach, right? Because the forest is so big, natural processes can go on unhindered within the forest. However, that is not a possibility today, even I think in the Amazon, because it has become so severely fragmented, right? There may be slightly bigger chunks, but on average, it will be much smaller than it used to be. And though these small habitat patches, whether it's a forest or say a water body or a water hole, they cannot sustain themselves. Humans must intervene. Humans must intervene. Then, secondly, the surrounding landscapes are so highly modified that it will definitely inflict harm on the natural habitats. So, the interactive elements and processes, identifying them, right, should take these two facts into consideration. First is natural habitats have become either degraded or too small to sustain themselves. Human intervention is needed. And the human interventions around these patches have become so intense that they would inevitably have some impact on these habitat patches. Now, what are these critical elements and processes that we are talking of? Number one, heterogeneity. Heterogeneous habitats, heterogeneous landscapes must be conserved. If you are to maintain the natural processes and the elements, heterogeneity must be preserved. For example, if you have been asked to protect a mountain area, right, a particular region of a mountain, if you are to protect the entire diversity and to protect the natural processes, then you must ensure that you protect the gradient, not the top of the mountain, not the bottom of the mountain, but a gradient from the bottom to the top. Then you would increase your chances of getting the maximum benefits in terms of the processes and the goods and conserving biodiversity. Then what about a coastal environment? If it's a coastal environment, say estuary or a lagoon, you must not only focus on the lagoon, you must, the entire gradient from the sea to the lagoon to an inland area, that entire gradient must be preserved if you are wanting to preserve the maximum, the optimal benefits. That is the processes and the elements. If you are to conserve the maximum, then you would have to look at a gradient. Right? So heterogeneity, even if you take a forest or say mixed habitat like let's say Waskamo, right? You have the grasslands, you have the rock outcrops, you have the forests, you have the riverine vegetation. So that heterogeneity, if you're protecting that landscape, so that will affect the scale, isn't it? If you want to only protect one type of habitat, the scale may be small. But if you want to protect the heterogeneity, then you have to increase the scale. Right? Then number two, suitable habitats and landscape structures. You must ensure that within that area that you wish to conserve or focus on, you include a lot of suitable habitats. When you say it may be a rainforest, it may be a mangrove patch, habitats that are identified as being suitable for animals and plants. Then what about landscape? So here the patch quality and size. Now you're talking about patches, no? Patch quality and size. That is the quality. If it's a very degraded patch, then it won't be suitable, no? Right? Then you can avoid that. Right? So look for the best quality patches and the largest of patches that you can find in order to include in the area that you're trying to, in the landscape that you're trying to conserve. Then you must include unique features. For example, there might be one massive tree in the center of a grassland. So when you're conserving a grassland and that habitat, you would have to include that tree because that tree in that habitat would be immensely beneficial for the species. Maybe a rock outcrop within a forest. You have a big forest, a large forest, but if you're conserving it, you have to include Maybe just adjacent, you have a rock outcrop, which may be a little away from the forest. You have to include that into your landscape because those are unique elements, unique features. As an ecologist, I know such rock outcrops are very important for small mammals, for herpetofauna, that is lizards, reptiles, right? So you have to get that into your landscape. Then certain hydrological elements, streams, water bodies, catchments, springs, right? So when you're looking at a landscape, at what scale, you have to see whether there are these important elements, because these would add to the benefits in terms of goods and services that this landscape will offer. Then what about connectivity? Right? So if there are two massive habitat patches, we'll say forests, are you going to, you may include both, but maybe you can't because there are other land uses. But at least, are you going to try and include like stepping stones in between the forest patches or a corridor? Right? If there's a barrier, you can say if there's a little hamlet or something, say a stone quarry, you can avoid that. But you have to take in other factors, like a corridor that you can probably include in your plan, overall plan. So landscape becomes wider and wider when you look at all these elements, right? You might initially start with the forest, but if you look at the interactiveness and the processes that go on, you would have to include little by little, you might have to expand and look at a larger, a broader landscape. Then of course, priority species. Sometimes all these priority species means threatened species, endemic species, species that have high conservation work, habitat specialists, right? So even if your habitat, the little habitat patch that you're looking at is further away, you might have to include that also into the landscape that you're thinking of conserving, because that particular tiny stream or tiny habitat has a particular endemic frog. So looking at that separately is not going to work. You take it together in your landscape. So it becomes clear that conservation of all these elements and processes requires the consideration of a broader landscape. So here I have shown you a few instances where, you know, in the first instance, you can see sprawling grassy plains. So if you're asked to protect the habitat, you must, of course, a large expanse will be the grassy plain, but you can see that there are tiny forest patches nestled within that grassy plain. And therefore, you must bring that into your conservation scale. Then rock outcrops, like on your right? So these might be right within the habitat patch you're considering, then it's all right. But even if it's just outside, you must then bring that into your broader landscape that you want to conserve, because many other forest species might also be using these as refuges. Then look at the tree on the extreme bottom on the right. Again, in a open grass area, this tree would be extremely useful as a refuge site for bats, for birds, for insects. Then on the bottom, now here it's an interesting little spring on the bottom left, right? Now this, you know, the Valikada prison is being translocated to Millava in Horana, right? And this is within a rubber plantation. In a rubber plantation where we came across this spring, but they have built a little structure in ancient times. So we asked them, so this was surrounded by a rubber plantation, right? But we asked them to preserve a rubber plantation in one area. After discovering this, we told them to extend the area of conservation to include this spring, because during the dry season, this spring would be a source of water for many species. So if we excluded this spring, that patch that we are trying to conserve may not survive, because during the dry season, the animals come here to drink. So therefore, and similarly, this little waterway, you can see in a very disturbed habitat, a little waterway, these are critical elements that you should be looking for when you're designing your landscape conservation plan, right? You must get all these little elements which would add to your biodiversity, which should add to your ecosystem services into your broader landscape, right? So when you ask at what scale, you can't give a ready-made answer, because it depends on the processes and the interactions and the elements that are included. Looking at the whole landscape, you can decide, okay, this area would be the area that we should focus our attention on. It can't be endless, no. You have to draw a line somewhere, a boundary somewhere. So where do you draw the boundary? It all depends on your landscape and the critical elements that are nestled within the landscape, where you have the interactions between the people, the animals, and the plants, and the abiotic processes like, say, hydrology, for example. So this would also kind of depict that sometimes it means a lot to encompass human. Now, all this time we were kind of looking at natural habitats, but that's not necessarily so, right? You have urban wildlife, you have rural home gardens. All of these can be brought into your landscape that you're trying to conserve. But conservation means that you intervene. You can't just say, okay, this area is conserved and rest. Even the human modified environments within that broad landscape must be managed in an eco-friendly manner, right? Because you know that humans benefit. They harness forest services, for example, as I said earlier, the bees and the bats might be living in the forest, but they might come to feed on insects in the plantation. So for the human, that will be an ecosystem service provided by the natural predators. Sometimes they might roost in the human modified habitats, but go and feed in the forest. Some bats roost in trees in human or even in urban habitats. But to feed, they might go to rural landscapes. So both of these factors, people, wildlife, and the habitats must all be brought in if you are, and managed if you are to conserve the entire landscape. So here again, I have shown that it is not only a protected area, right? It is also people-dominated habitats, but people-dominated habitats should be managed in such a way that it will not be detrimental to the natural environment, right? So when you say landscape conservation, you can't only protect the forests and let the human modified landscapes be as it is. You must intervene and manage them in an eco-friendly manner, right? Now, I don't want to go into details about whether the use of chemical fertilizers or organic fertilizers is better for obvious reasons. But in all sense, you have the protected areas that are managed by the Forest Department and the Department of Wildlife Conservation. But if you're having a landscape plan, then you must also have some hold on the human modified environments, whether it's human settlements, whether it's cultivation. It has to be managed in such a way that it will not inflict any damage to the protected areas that are within that broader landscape. So maintain anthropogenic habitats in an eco-friendly manner, basically. Right? So conservation areas are not always only in natural habitats. You have the landscape would also include a lot of human modified habitats. Now, one of the examples on how to weave in both human modified environments with conserving species or their habitats is the story of this Bandula barb. Right? This Bandula barb, a beautiful endemic fish, is restricted to a small stream in Kegol. Right? Small stream in Kegol, and is surrounded by rubber plantations and rice paddies. So in 2007, they discovered that only about 150 individuals are alive in that stream. And that was found nowhere else in Sri Lanka. So it was a point endemic, so to speak. And at that point, they tried to introduce this fish to other little streams around, which they thought were also similar little forest streams. But it was a failure, right? So now this was by no means a protected area. It was right amidst a cultivation, rubber and paddies, rice paddies. So then they had to get the help of the people, sensitize them, make them aware of the importance of this species, made it actually a tourist attraction, because the people could, if they save this fish in that river, it could be marketed as a visitor attraction, foreign and local visitors, because many pass through Kegol, right? So once that was done, IUCN took the lead role. Professor Devaka was involved from our department, right? And then at that time, they were able to, talk to the farmers, insist on certain pesticides not being used. The rubber plantations were also notified, and now they have come to a fairly good position where this fish is now showing signs of increase. So a partnership between the people and the conservationists were able to salvage this species right amidst the human modified environment. Landscape conservation is the only solution for the elephant. Why do I say that? Now you know this is a hotly debated topic in Sri Lanka, and we have grappled with this for the past decades, but with little progress. Every day over news, you would see that either people are killed or elephants are killed, or property damaged, or crops damaged, right? Now, can you restrict elephants to protected areas? You can't. Why? Because they're wide-ranging. By nature, they have a massive body size, right? And therefore, they have to eat 18 hours of the day. And in order to eat that amount of food, they have to range widely. The forest patches are small, and we are making them smaller, right? So the elephants obviously do not have sufficient food in the forest. Then what about the electric fence? The food sometimes within the patch is not enough. They are not going to be browsing on the forest when there's better rice paddies outside, right? So they would, when they see the nice green paddy fields outside, obviously they're going to feed on those. In order to conserve the elephant, you must conserve the forest as well as a buffer zone. Now, this buffer zone can be plantations. So during the cultivation season, those plantations can be protected by fences, but after cultivation, you can remove the fence and allow the animals to feed, right? Fences are a must, right? They can be reinforced with, you say, the bioshields like growing dehi or something like that. But to protect the elephant, you can't, contain them into a forest, but you have to protect the landscape around. So I think I will just browse through because I mentioned primates. In Sri Lanka, and this species, the Kalani riverine patches, which are sometimes not within protected areas, they are in human. Now, critical elements are sometimes linked to anthropogenic issues. So, for example, you must look at a landscape because of human interventions. For example, this is the Kaibalita forest, right? And 2 reservoirs were proposed to be built for water, for drinking water. Now, if you just look at one of these reservoirs, only say the number, but if you look at
Seems like we have a connection issue. Hold on a moment.
can you all hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
madam.
madam.
Okay, so I'll just roughly run through because I think I lost my connection there. Anyway, so the landscape projects, right, provide win-win solutions for wildlife and people. Sometimes you need a trade-off. You might lose one service, for example, if
Excuse me,
you're,
madam.
yes,
Madam, we can't see the screen.
you can't see the screen. Okay, I will unshare. What happened there? Let me see again. I will share again. Is it okay now?
Yes, madam. Now we can see.
Okay. So I'll just run through. So these landscape conservation solutions provide a win-win situation for both people and wildlife, right? Sometimes you might have to look at a broad, a longer term solution, in the sense you might reap benefits only in the longer term, right? Immediately you might, for example, lose your plot of land if you say, okay, these areas must be set aside for a corridor. Yes, you lose land. However, in time to come, that corridor might bring in benefits from tourism. And this is something that we have experienced in the Victoria-Rantambe region, where certain areas we had to preserve, and that came at the cost of people's plantations. But we said, look, we can develop this as a wildlife tourism corridor, so that you can earn your money, the money that you lost, perhaps even greater amounts from tourism, right? So then also landscape conservation would allow in the long run to preserve both the natural and the human modified environments, which will help you to save money, say on fertilizer, pesticides, because you're conserving the natural predators. And then landscape, say you would lose a plot of your land to a forest, but the land that you're left with might increase in value, because if you look at your land value, because you're surrounded by a forest, your land value will go up, right? So you have benefits, even if sometimes it means that you have to have a trade-off. I will not look at this, but here I just like to show you, we did a landscape level analysis, and we were able to identify areas. Now the ones in red are those areas that are currently being protected, but we were able to identify other areas that can be included into our current protected area network. So looking at a landscape scale would make sense rather than looking at a small spatial scale. So here you can read through this. I have just quoted this Hodder et al. A paper, right, where they say that they have done an experiment and they have found landscape conservation to reap many, many benefits. And some of these have been given here. So is this possible, right? People, profit, and the ecology or the planet. Is it possible? Yes, it is. And it's currently enacted by this ESCAM project, where it's Ecosystem Conservation and Management Project. ESCAM stands for that. And where they have used both elements, the people and the wildlife and the ecosystem in general, in order to devise landscape management plans. So you can read up on the ESCAM project under the Forest Department. By the name, by the virtue of its name, it says that it focuses on large-scale landscapes rather than on small forests. So the community, and I saw that you'll have a little slogan saying conservation communities and landscape architects, right? So communities are an important element because they must be brought in to the framework of management. You must listen to the ideas if they are allowed to voice their opinion. And sometimes when you just go and tell them, we want to preserve this, they might not understand. But if you make them understand, we are going to preserve this, these are the benefits of it, then you can come to some mutual agreement with the communities in order to make your landscape plans more successful. You can incorporate traditional knowledge, right? You're not just going to impose restrictions, but rather and then if something goes wrong, they are not going to turn back and find fault with you because you have brought them into the whole network of management. They are as responsible as you because they were all part of the management plan, right? So that's one of the most important things, is because you can get them involved in the decision making. You can sense if you're going to, before imposing something, you just tell them, we are thinking of doing this. What's your idea, right? So before you can avoid all the protests and all the unpleasantness if you are more open, more transparent, and work with them as a key stakeholder group. So landscape management and planning is possible in rural landscapes like our ancient rural agroecosystems, and also in urban landscapes. But harsh decisions are needed where you have to use some, forcing the, say, for example, a particular method of cultivation, a particular soil conservation method, whatever, because you have to value your green capital. We are a tropical country, and we have a lot of green capital which we have not valued at all. So these are some of the important ideas that I wish to put across. I won't go through the conclusions because probably you might have questions to ask me. You can read through this. So thank you very much. And although it seems bleak, it is not altogether too late if we pull up our socks and work towards managing and conserving the landscapes. So I will end there, and I think I will take a few questions if you have.
What an amazing and insightful session that was. As we have neared the end of today's discussion, now it's time for questions. If you have not yet submitted your questions, you can click on the link that is posted in the chat box and post your questions in the Google form there. Okay, so let's commence the Q&A session. The first question is, conservation of heterogeneity in forest is an issue to the recent development of projects in Sri Lanka. How can we not harm a niche and move forward with the developments? Should we change the circulation paths of the organisms?
Yes, actually, it is a challenge because the broader and broader you get, the more and more challenges or the barriers you would have to overcome in terms of conservation. Protecting a protected area only is also a challenge. Why do I say that? Now, this is not a political discussion, but I have been part of discussions where areas of already protected areas have been asked to be degazetted or released for development. So what about if that is allowed, then what for talking about other areas that are not protected? Now, if you, the Thalangama Highway, that area has been declared as an environmental sensitive area and it is gazetted. Then how come we are trying to put a highway across that area? So the government proposes to de-gazette that particular area in order for the highway to go, right? So yes, it is a challenge. That's why I said you have to have harsh decisions, right? If your landscape necessarily has to include heterogeneity, you have to do that, maybe at the cost of moving people out, at the cost of even allowing people to live there, but only, now for example, a sanctuary, right? The Kumana, there's a sanctuary, Bellang Vilattidiya sanctuary. The idea of a sanctuary is that it has private lands inside, but the rule is that you can't change your livelihood. For example, you can't, if you have a little paddy cultivation, you can't stop your paddy cultivation and, fill up that land. You can't do that. You are allowed to live there, but under certain conditions, right? So if, yes, it is a tough task. It's a tough calling, particularly for conservationists. We are constantly battling problems like this. But we have to stand firm. And certain sacrifices are necessary, but what you have to make people see is the long-term goal, long-term gain that they may not see at the present moment. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, madam. Madam, the second question is converting of water bodies into marshlands and others with time due to eutrophication and other ecological factors can occur. Since it's a natural occurrence, should we let it happen or somehow avoid natural changes by artificial methods?
Yeah, a good question once again. We should intervene. Now, it all depends on what you're trying to preserve. Now, for example, if you're preserving, let's say, Belangvilla or the Thalangama Lake, right? The natural thing is for sedimentation to happen, and then there'll be eutrophication, and then that will turn into a dry land. Now, the Thalangama Lake we want to preserve because we want to preserve the water body and the fauna and flora associated with the water body. So if the water body is going to turn into a dry land, yes, we must intervene. Now, the problem is, when it happens naturally, it will take, say, 100 years. But with human action, right, discharging effluents into the water body, increasing nutrients, will allow a lot of invasives to start going, and it will become eutrophic faster than it would happen naturally, right? And that eutrophication will increase siltation, and that will turn into a dry land. But that's not what you're protecting. You want to protect the water body and the biota. Because that is an intermediate successional stage. You would have done now for your O-levels, right? Even your A-levels, natural succession. So if you want to protect the intermediate stage, like a water body, like a grassland, even a grassland, right? If you want to protect the grassland and the biota, or the water body and the biota, then you have to intervene by dredging, if it's a grassland, by setting fire regularly. You have to intervene in order to stop that succession. And now it's more of a problem because humans are accelerating succession. So yes, to answer to your question, we have to intervene. And that's the correct thing to do.
Thank you, madam. The third question is reforesting an already uniquely changed area, such as Aruwakkalu quarry site, is it a good idea, or do you think we should let it be?
Once again, a tough question. Now, if there's a conflicting use, right? Conflicting use, for example, between letting it out for garbage dumping, right? We know that's a garbage dump. And reforestation was done by Holcim, which used that Aruwakkalu site, because I'm quite familiar with that site because I've worked there, right? In my opinion, if it's in a critical location, for example, a part of that falls at the mouth of the Kalaoya, and it's a beautiful location, right? Those areas should be reforested because there's a connection between that and Vilpattu. So critical areas should be recognized. But when I say critical areas, earlier in my presentation, I said you must identify critical elements. So now animals move along the Kalaoya, right? Along the Kalaoya, 2 elephants, leopard, deer, bear, all those move from the Kalaoya basin, from some of these mangrove patches to the Vilpattu forest. So those areas in those parts must be reforested and preserved. But perhaps a more outer area, because there's a high demand for land for conflicting users, areas outside probably can be let out for eco-friendly uses. For example, not maybe for total clearance and for putting up buildings, but perhaps for other uses, maybe paddy cultivation or something like that, uses that will not affect the Vilpattu and the Kalaoya basin, because you know the Kalaoya and the Vilpattu is also declared as a Ramsar site.
Thank you, madam. And the fourth question is, as landscape architects, sometimes we face situations where we have to recreate the ecosystems in existing environment. Wouldn't that be a disturbance to the ecological balance of the context?
Can you read that again? Sometimes we have to degrade the ecosystem. Is that what you're saying?
As landscape architects,
Yes.
sometimes we face situations where we have to recreate the
Recreate the ecosystems. Well, it depends. I think it's all right, but within limits, right? For example, yes, you might create a wetland. You might create a wetland near a hotel, right? And creating that wetland, what are you going to use? Are you going to use a part of a large water body? Creating the wetland might even improve the biodiversity and ecosystem services of that water body, right? But if it's a tiny water body and you're going to fill it and you're going to make it a marsh, that might be a problem. So while recreation is important, because now, for example, in an urban setting, you can recreate a forest, and that's beneficial, isn't it? Right? But if you're not going to clear very, very seldom are you going to clear a natural habitat. No, it's most of the time you're trying to create a natural or mimic a natural habitat, and that would be very beneficial, both for the people and for the wildlife and for ecosystem services as well. But as I said, now, for example, planting mangroves is not always good, right? Because many of our estuaries are now shallow. And one of the reasons is because, the mangroves act as sediment traps. So the more sediment traps you have, the faster the lagoon will get filled up, and then that will affect the fishery. So therefore, you must have a sense of what it will do to the ecosystem and the ecosystems around, right? But in an urban location, creating a natural habitat would be good. But if you're going to tamper with a natural habitat, then you must know the consequences before, rather than be sorry. You should be informed of what it can do to the natural ecosystem, your intervention.
Thank you, madam. The next question is, monkeys are found commonly in neighborhood clusters. Swigging on trees disturb the living of villagers. So we need to prioritize monkeys or villagers as landscape architects. So do we need to prioritize monkeys or villagers as landscape architects? Should we limit the habitat area of the other one?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because actually this is a problem. This purple face leaf, now it depends on what you term by monkey. You have the macaca, the Vilava, Macaca sinica, Vilava, who's adapted to live in human habitations. It's not found in the middle of a forest, no, right? So macaques live with people. And then if you are to protect your plantation, you would have to not use air rifles or traps. But there are other friendly measures, animal friendly measures that you can keep to keep your coconut trees or your other fruit trees safe, right? But for example, the purple face leaf monkey has become a problem in the wet zone. Now that species has become a problem because their habitat is diminishing. They are not species who are adapted to live in human habitats. but they have been forced to live in human habitats because their habitats, they are canopy species. If I just go to this, I skip because of the time restriction. Yeah, so these species are canopy species, right? They live on canopy tops. They rarely descend to the ground, right? And they feed on leaves. But now they have started feeding on fruit, jackfruit, A. They have come out because now these tiny habitat patches are isolated. They can't move from one patch to the other without going across the houses. That is the problem of home gardens. If you have the habitat corridors, these animals are never going to be a problem in your home garden. So I make a distinction between the Rilavas and the purple-faced leaf monkey. Purple-faced leaf monkey is a forest species. And therefore, if you protect the forests and corridors, it will not come to your home garden. But on the other hand, if you take the Rilava, it is a species that lives around human habitats. It's not found in the middle of the forest. And therefore, you would have to take some initiatives to protect your habitat without there are eco-friendly means of doing that.
Thank you, Madam. Madam, what is your opinion about buffer zone management around projected area within Sri Lankan context? How buffer zone management help to protect the core areas of the forest?
Yes and no, in the sense, buffer zone areas are critical. They are critical, but sadly, as I said earlier, when areas of forests are also being gazetted, for talking of the buffer. So buffer zones are essential, and it will, that's why the name you call it a buffer, because it's going to protect your car. A car buffer will protect the car from an accident. So similarly, a buffer zone should have that intention. Now, if you have a man and biosphere reserve, the ideal structure is you have the forest and you have it's called a transition zone, which is essentially like a buffer zone. But the idea of that buffer zone or the transition zone is not for people to do what they want. People can live there. People can use the buffer zone, but under certain conditions. But sadly, these are not met. Now, if you take the dry zone, as I said, one of the most important mitigatory measures of the human-elephant conflict is having a buffer zone. Elephants are not going to stick inside the forest and start, particularly in the dry season, when you can see the kuburu, lush paddies and the banana plantations outside. They are not going to browse on the already dry forest trees. So there's no point, and it's not like a mouse that you can stop, right? It is an elephant. So if they wish to move, and if they have been habitually moving out of the forest during the dry season to feed on the grass and the remnants of the rice paddies during the non-harvesting season, they will do that. Whether you stand on your head, they will do that. If you put the fences around the forest so that the elephants can't break them, then the elephants will die in the forest because they don't have food to eat. They will have food during the rainy season, but during the dry season, they need to go out because the forest does not have the grasses. They prefer grasses, and the forest does not have the adequate food supply that they require. So you see them going out. And even the buffer zone is not protected, and the cultivations are plainly visible, and the very fact that they are growing very preferable food items like paddy, right? How can you stop the elephants from going? So having a managed buffer with the correct crops grown at the correct time, opened out to the elephants at other times, because you can mark up the elephants in I think in Thailand or Bhutan. They earn loads of money they cultivate during the wet season and open out those fields during the dry season, and the people earn from the foreigners that come to see the elephants feeding on the remnant rice paddies. Right? So buffer zones are critical, but sadly, we do not. It's just only on paper. We have no proper management systems for buffer zones, but they're critical for managing biodiversity, species, and ecosystem services.
Thank you, Madam. I'm sure our audience gained a lot of insight from hearing the ideas and views of our wonderful guest speaker, Professor Mayuri Vijayasinghe. Thank you, Madam, for the words of inspiration. This session would not have been possible if not for our amazing audience. And your feedback means a lot to us. So now it's time to express your views about today's session. First, I would like to invite someone representing first year to give us your feedback.
Good evening. I'm Natasha Parnaheva from Level 1. On behalf of the Level 1, I would like to express our gratitude for organizing this kind of valuable session to strengthen our awareness about the landscape conservation and its benefits to wildlife and people. So many thanks to Professor Mayuri Vijayasinghe and the organizing team. Thank you.
Next.
Can I also apologize for having to rush through? I took a little more time in the first half. So sorry, I had to rush through. Okay.
It's all right, Madam. We had a wonderful session. Next, I would like to invite someone representing the second year to give us your feedback.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pooja Vishwani from BLA 19. And today's session was very interesting, Madam. And we were inspired by all these aspects of conservation. As landscape architecture students and future landscape architects, that we have a big responsibility in saving to serve. So thank you so much, Madam, for these inspiring moments. And thank you to all our SSLA members for organizing this great event. Thank you.
Next, I would like to invite someone representing the third year to give us your feedback.
Hello, I'm Umesha from Level 3. On behalf of our batch, I would like to tell that the lecture is really interesting and the landscape always bridges the processes between humans and biodiversity. The facts and explanations you did widen up our ideas in the aspect of conservation, which is often used in our design thinking, but not broadly identified in the current scenario. And so thank you, Professor, for letting us focus our knowledge through this interesting topic and bringing back this kind of topics on board. Thank you.
Finally, I would like to invite someone representing the fourth year to give us your feedback.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Apeksha Sikrini from Level 4. On behalf of the finalist students, I would like to thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule to this wonderful lecture about the landscape conservation and the conservation interventions and methods. Your presence and wise words help magnify our knowledge in the best possible ways. This knowledge gained through this will also be of great help to our academic activities. Again, thank you, Professor Mayuri Vijayasinghe, for the valuable knowledge that is shared with us. And finally, thank you, the SSLA committee, to organizing this interesting session.
Thank you all for your valuable feedback. As all good things must come to an end, we have come to the end of today's session. Let me now invite the Assistant Secretary of the SSLA, Sadhmini Nishani, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor for me to get the opportunity to thank you all. On behalf of the Student Society of Landscape Architecture, University of Moratuwa, I would like to express my gratitude to all esteemed participants of the 4th Law Station episode for your utmost contribution to make this event a great success. Especially, I extend my heartiest gratitude to our honorable guest speaker, Professor Mayur Vijayasinghe, to take out time from her busy schedule to grace this event. I'm sure that each and every fact that you shared today will make us more concerned on our individual duties on environment as well as society as responsible personalities. We also have been fortunate to have all our senior staff members, Dean of the Faculty, Faculty of Architecture, Dr. D.P. Chandrasekhara, Head of the Department, Department of Architecture, Architect Janaka Vijayasundara, former Head of the Department, Department of Architecture, Senior Treasurer of SSLA, Dr. Gamini Veerasinghe, Course Director of Landscape Architecture Studies in University of Moratuwa, Professor Shirani Balasuriya, and Landscape Architect, Madam Shireen Amendra. Dear Sir and Madam, I thank you for your immense support to make all these events a great success. Furthermore, I extend my thanks to all the internal lecturers, especially Landscape Architect Rasul Vangasekara and Landscape Architect Shamin Dharmasena, for your guidance and support to organize this event. I may also like to express my sincere gratitude to all the respected invitees for today's event. Last but not least, I must thank the organizing committee for working hard to make this event a great success. Thank you everyone once again. We will meet you all with another successful event in the near future. Stay safe and good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, Madam.
Thank you, Sadhamini. That brings us to the end of the 4th episode of Law Station. Save to serve. Thank you all for your participation. We hope to see you again at the next episode of Law Station. Until we meet again, stay safe. Good night.